Okay, good morning. Now that we finished the Civil War, we find ourselves in the period or the historical era immediately following the Civil War, and we call that the Reconstruction period or Reconstruction. And it refers to the complicated process of putting the country that had been rendered into two from the Civil War back into one political national unit again. And you can see here on the slide that I'm referring to it to as a monumental failure. And you might be thinking, well, Mr. Colton, that's pretty harsh to call a historical era a failure. Aren't there some positives and negatives that come out of everything? And you'd be right, um, except that I typically like to talk about the Reconstruction or the failures of Reconstruction as being responsible for a lot of the underlying problems that we're going to see in American society. And hey, it's June 5th, 2020, and all you need to do is flip on the news and get some kind of an indication as to why this period didn't exactly work well. Next year you guys are going to spend a lot of time in the civil rights era, and to be successful in the civil rights era as a student of American history, you're going to need to understand some of the failures of the Reconstruction period. So let's get into it. Well, Abraham Lincoln is the greatest president in American history, with the exception of George Washington. And we can say that because even though he was president for a scant 5 years, he does something that no one thought was possible in 1862 and 1863, which is he brings about a successful end to the Civil War in a way that maintains the integrity of the Union. So, and I encourage you to go back and take a look at the Gettysburg Address. Some people or some historians consider that very short speech to be a rededication of the Union, or breathing a new breath of life into the American nation. I'm not sure that that's true, but it's certainly true that Abraham Lincoln accomplishes the impossible. So that's his first great task, and everything that he does during his presidency is aimed at that task. Well, Lincoln's been reelected in 1864. He beats McClellan. He gives his second inaugural address where he promises or lays out a broad theme for how he's going to bring the country back together. And then the Civil War ends, and he's faced with task number 2. And that's, how is it that we bring the country back together? How will we reconstruct the nation? And Lincoln doesn't get to do that. And the reason is that guy right there. So, disgruntled Southern actor, one of the most famous men in America at the time. He was a guy that everybody's name, or everybody had known his name prior to the assassination. So that's John Wilkes Booth. Hates Abraham Lincoln. He's an avowed white supremacist. When he finds out about the plans for the 13th and then the 14th Amendment, he becomes incensed, enraged. This is going to mean African Americans voting, African American citizenship, and he wants to pay back Lincoln and the Union for all the pain that his country, the South, had endured. So he puts together a conspiracy of like-minded people. He's a pretty smart guy, but the crew that he puts together, the crew he assembles, is the gang who couldn't shoot straight, and he's going to do a decapitation strike against the executive branch. So his plan is to take out the Secretary of War. He's going to take out the Secretary of State if he can. He's going to kill the president. He's going to kill the vice president. They're going to assassinate or kidnap some of these people. The only part of the assassination plot that actually is successful in killing its target is booths. So being an actor, he has access to Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., which is still there. It's still there as a museum and a theater. And he sneaks into the presidential box and he sticks a 22 pistol behind his ear and shoots him in the brain. Lincoln's carried across the street and is dead within 24 hours. And now he belongs to the ages. So Lincoln's assassinated there in April. And the country is just torn apart by the news. Problem here is Lincoln's cabinet, made up of his formal rivals, exert a lot of pressure and a lot of control. They're members of what we call the radical Republican wing. So gradually, because all the Democrats have been expelled because their states have left the Union, or many of them have been expelled because their states have left the Union, the Republican Party drifts farther and farther into extreme radical abolition. And it's being led by people like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. You'll recall Charles Sumner is the guy from Massachusetts that got beaten over the head with a cane and put into a coma. Well, he's out of the coma now and he's back. And Stevens from Pennsylvania and Sumner from Massachusetts and William Seward and Chief Justice Chase and that crew is going to fight with Andrew Johnson, who was a Democrat that Lincoln selected just to bring the Democratic and the Republican parties together in a time of unity. Well, now he's the president. And this is going to set up the first great fight during Reconstruction. Lincoln had a plan. And Lincoln's plan was, let's treat the South gently. Let's not confiscate any private property. Let's give them all their land back. And as soon as the state comes back into the Union and declares the revolution to be over, the rebellion to be over, they can be part of America again. So he's got a plan. Well, Andrew Johnson's plan is going to be a little bit different. And then the radical Republicans in Congress are going to have their own plan as well. So you can pause it here and take some notes on the two conflicting plans. But Johnson's plan is, in order for a state to be reconstructed, in order for a state to come back into the country, you have to ratify the 13th Amendment, meaning you have to say that the 13th Amendment exists, banning slavery. You have to write a new state constitution. Confederate debt from the war has to be renounced, meaning if a state borrowed money to pay for the rebellion, they have to default on that debt. And that's something that, and you might be thinking, well, isn't that bad for the financial stability of that state? And you're right, but it's the kind of thing that discourages future rebellion. Who does Johnson want to be in charge of the South? Well, Johnson is, like Booth, a white supremacist. He hates everybody. He hates the planter aristocracy, the people who had owned hundreds of slaves. He also hates the freedmen. He also hates the former slaves. He also hates his liver. He's a terrible alcoholic. But who does he want to run the South? He wants those poor, white, independent farmers to direct the South and to run the South. White men must run the South. That's Andrew Johnson. Radical Republicans have a different plan. They want African American suffrage, meaning they want the freedmen, former slaves, to be a political power in the South. They want this for two reasons. One, a lot of them believe in equality, which is still a pretty controversial idea here in the 1860s. But they also know that when these African Americans, when these former slaves start voting, most likely they'll vote Republican, because that's the political party responsible for their manumission, responsible for them not being slaves anymore. They will require 13th and 14th Amendment be ratified. They're responsible for the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which is the most important piece of civil rights legislation, probably until the Civil Rights Act of 1968. And the creation of something called the Freedmen's Bureau, with General Howard at the helm. And that's an organization that's dedicated to improving the status, the economic and the educational status of former enslaved people. Okay. And these guys are fighting back and forth. Do we need former Confederates to take a loyalty oath? Do we exclude former Confederates from government? If so, for how long? Will we punish former leaders of the Confederacy? If so, how? So these two can't get along with their plans. Meanwhile, here's Johnson on the left. So Johnson comes in, and Ulysses S. Grant, extremely popular, is still the head of the Army. And Johnson, as part of his plan to punish the former leaders of the Confederacy, wants to start arresting people. Now, it's interesting that this rebellion is responsible for killing, if you include civilian deaths, we're talking about 1 million people. But nobody is executed except the former commander of Andersonville Prison, Captain Wirtz, and the members of the Booth conspiracy to kill Lincoln. Nobody else is executed for their role in the Confederacy and the rebellion. Jefferson Davis goes to jail, but he only goes to jail for 2 years. It's remarkably lenient. It's remarkably liberal the way they treat these former Confederates. Well, Johnson wants to punish them. So Johnson orders the arrest of Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, now retired, writes a letter to Grant asking him, hey, you gave me parole. How can I be arrested if you've given me parole and I haven't violated the terms of my parole? And Grant says, well, you can't be arrested. And so Johnson and Grant go back and forth. Johnson wants to punish. Grant had given his word. And Grant says, if you arrest Robert E. Lee, I will resign from the Army and you will not have an Army commander. And Johnson says, well, that's fine. I've got somebody just as good. Who do you think it is? Very good. It's William Tecumseh Sherman. And he says, that's fine. I will replace you with Sherman. And Sherman writes a letter and says, if you fire Grant, I'm gone too. So Johnson has to back down. And none of the leaders, the military leaders of the Confederacy, are arrested or put in jail. Gradually, we have the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments. And I wanted to go over these briefly because they're super important to American history. One is the 13th Amendment. That's the amendment that outlaws slavery. Slavery or involuntary servitude cannot happen in America, with the exception of for prisoners. So if you're arrested and they make you work on a chain gang, or if you're arrested and you have to do like roadside cleanup duty, that's not slavery. No one can be forced into slavery or involuntary servitude unless they've committed a crime. That's the 13th Amendment. 14th Amendment is necessitated by the Dred Scott decision. Part of that Dred Scott decision, which we said was really terrible, was Chief Justice Taney said African Americans can never be considered citizens of the United States, and this reverses that. So everybody has the rights of a citizen, or your rights to citizenship cannot be taken away or denied to you because of your race, because of your color. And then finally, the last Reconstruction Amendment, the right to vote cannot be denied to you because of your race. And you might be thinking, well, if the 14th Amendment says that I have every right of citizenship and it can't be taken away from me because of my race, then why would the 15th Amendment be necessary? And my counter question to that would be, are there any citizens in the United States that we do not allow to vote for any reason? Right. So states at this point have denied the right to vote to women. So the thinking here is that in spite of the 14th Amendment, states could pass laws saying that only white people could vote. And the 15th is the way to make sure that doesn't happen. So now we have this showdown between Congress and Andrew Johnson. Congress starts passing bills related to Reconstruction and the occupation of the South, and Johnson will liberally use the veto. He starts vetoing everything. So just like we had Andrew Jackson being referred to as King Andy. Now we have people referring to Andrew Johnson as King Andy for the same reason. Congress, now being sick of this guy, will pass a law designed to trap the president into breaking it so that they can impeach him. And how can they do that? Well, they win a supermajority. So the states of the South being unreconstructed, they do not get to send representatives to the Senate or the House of Representatives. So this is overwhelmingly northern and western states. They are overwhelmingly Republican. They get their version passed over Johnson. They take the South and they carve it into these military districts with military commanders in charge of the civilian government. Johnson himself will violate that law that they passed just to get him to break it. It's called the Tenure of Office Act. It basically says that the president cannot remove members of his cabinet without the authority of Congress. It's an interesting perspective on advice and consent from the Constitution. Johnson broke it. He was then impeached by the House of Representatives, and he was not convicted by the United States Senate. So you know that in all of American history, we've had 3 presidents who were impeached. None of the 3 were convicted by the Senate. Johnson came very close. He was, I believe, 1 vote away from being convicted. So now that that's happened, now that that showdown has happened, and Johnson, his power is blunted, and it's clear that there'll be a new Republican president in 1868, what's the South going to look like? Well, the leadership of the Confederacy is excluded from holding office and will be until the Spanish-American War, 1898. And by that time, only very young leaders from the Confederacy were still around and still eligible to serve. African Americans registered to vote. Those former freedmen were the political power. And who's really running those states as they become reconstructed and brought back into the fold? Well, we talk about 2 distinct groups. One is the term carpetbagger, meaning somebody from the North who opportunistically, packs all his stuff into a suitcase, a cheap suitcase, and moves to the South so they can run for office or economically or politically exploit this new power vacuum. And they were derisively called carpetbaggers. It's a term that we still use in American politics today. So, if you're from New Jersey and you move to New York or Connecticut and you run for office there, they may accuse you of being a carpetbagger. Who is this guy who just showed up 15 minutes ago and now wants to be our senator? A scalawag is someone from the South who throws in with the new Republican leadership. You'll remember in 1860, there were no Republicans in the South. So if you had been a Democrat or you had been, someone associated with the Confederate cause, like, for example, James Longstreet, and you switch over to the other side, you may be accused of being a scalawag. Here's an interesting example just to kind of underscore what I'm talking about. This guy's name is Hiram Revels. He was the first and actually the last African-American senator from Mississippi. So during this period, you have a lot of political power moving from one class of people, one group of people, to another group of people. A lot of former slaves, a lot of freedmen registered to vote and become voters. And what happens? Well, if you'll recall my first slide, I gave you a beginning date and an end date for Reconstruction. Ulysses S. Grant becomes president of the United States and serves for 2 terms. He'll leave and decline a 3rd term because of failing health. And the election of 1876 becomes one of the most controversial in American history. And it's a little bit more complicated than to just say, well, the election of 1876 is the end of Reconstruction. But it's certainly one of those things that precipitates a death knell in the Reconstruction process. You know, Northern troops who had guaranteed the safety and the freedom of former slaves and their right to vote, their 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment rights, are removed from the South. And the South reconstructs itself and then gradually takes power back from those groups. And how did they do it? Well, the KKK is founded in 1866 by a former Confederate general named Nathan Bedford Forrest. Grant and Grant's administration will fight the KKK, but the KKK is this shadow government within a government who engages in voter intimidation for freedmen. If you register to vote, we will do bad things to you. The KKK is largely destroyed by the federal government, but it will come back in the 20th century. And next year, you guys, when you do early 20th century American history, you'll talk about the revival of the KKK. And when it comes back, it doesn't come back in the South, it comes back in the North. Many of the Redeemer governments passed poll taxes, meaning the 15th Amendment and the 14th Amendment say that we cannot keep African Americans from voting. But if we charge a fee to vote, then it disenfranchises or takes away the right to vote from people who are too poor to pay that fee. If you charge money to vote, then only people who have money can vote. Make sense? Another way to get around the 14th and 15th Amendment for these Southern governments was to institute something called a literacy test, meaning in order to vote, you have to prove that you're smart enough to actually cast your vote. And that sounds like a pretty good plan, except when you look at the execution of the plan. So, in a lot of these places, it's unintentionally funny, and we shouldn't laugh about it. But, somebody who is barely literate in a voter registration office in Mississippi, would be in charge of administering a literacy test to people who came in. You can barely read and write yourself, but somebody comes in off the street and wants to register to vote. Now, who do you think they're going to fail the literacy test? We had examples where, people, African Americans with like a PhD would walk in and fail the literacy test. And on the rejection notice, why did you fail the literacy test? It would say something like poor spelling, and the word spelling would be spelled wrong. So it was a law that was designed in execution to prevent freed African Americans from voting. Of course, with the poll tax and the literacy test comes an unintended problem. If the way that I'm keeping African Americans from voting is to keep poor people and illiterate people from voting, then I run the risk that I'm going to disenfranchise or take the right to vote away from poor, illiterate white people. So how do I guarantee that poor, illiterate white people will still be allowed to vote? A lot of counties and a lot of states passed what we call grandfather clauses when it came to voting. So if you could prove, for example, that your grandfather had voted in an election, then maybe the poll tax or the literacy test did not apply to you. And who were the only people who had grandfathers who voted in elections before the 1860s? Precisely. So once the Union Army and once the North leaves the South, it's a process that takes a generation. But by the time we get to the 1940s and the 1950s, ladies and gentlemen, you go into some of these counties in Mississippi and Alabama, and the county might be 50 or 60% African American, but there might only be one or two African Americans who are registered to vote in that county for that reason. So it takes a generation, but the South basically gets to run itself again from 1876 to the beginning of the Civil Rights era. In terms of the way that we circumvent the way that we get around the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. A lot of these Southern governments begin passing laws and municipalities begin passing laws that were designed to keep white people in one place and black people in another place. So next year you'll talk about the Jim Crow laws, which is a form of American apartheid. And the idea that you're going to have separate laws and separate places and separate parks and separate benches and separate entrances and separate water fountains for different races of people seems like it would violate the 14th Amendment on its face. And so that triggers a Supreme Court case. And the last Supreme Court case we're going to talk about here is Plessy v. Ferguson, which ensconces in American legal doctrine the idea that it is not a violation of one's 14th Amendment right to keep people separate, so long as those separate accommodations are equal. So what you're writing down in your notebook now is Plessy versus Ferguson equals doctrine of separate but equal. And that will stand, stare decisis, as settled American legal law, legal principle, until it is overturned in 1957 by landmark Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, and the Linda Brown case. So all of these things you'll talk about next year when you do the civil rights era. So the end of Reconstruction.